This is episode 32 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, I'm Ben Crystal, actor, author, and explorer of original practices in Shakespeare. And another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
On stage, as at court, a king's costume then would include a crown, jewels, furs, expensive fabrics. But the difference was that on stage, the crown was made of metal, the jewels were colored glass, and the fur was probably rabbit dyed to look like ermine.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
If we took a photograph of every King Lear ever staged, they would all be wearing a different costume. So which one's correct? Well, when it comes to Shakespeare's stage directions, he is of very little help to production companies because rarely, if at all, are the costumes of a particular play detailed out anywhere by Shakespeare himself. Of course, his characters wore costumes on stage as well as used props, but what exactly were the costumes when Shakespeare was performing his plays? Here this week to help us understand the role of costumes for William Shakespeare is our very special guest, Patricia Lennox. Patricia Lennox teaches at the Gallatin School of New York University and has been a global lecturer in sites in London and Florence, Italy. She edited As You Like It for new Kittredge Shakespeare Series, and her articles are included in multiple books about William Shakespeare, including the one we've invited her to speak with us about today that she co-edited called Shakespeare and Costume, which came out in 2015. Patricia's article in that collection focuses on the character of Juliet's nurse and how costume helped that character develop her iconic personality. Today, Patricia will be taking us behind the curtain to look into the wardrobe department for William Shakespeare's theaters and explore how the Bard handled costuming in the 16th century. Patricia, welcome to the show.
Thank you. In
her book, Shakespeare and Costume, Patricia says that costumes are an integral part of any stage production, but also that costumes are influenced by contemporary clothing. Now, Patricia, will you reconcile these ideas for us somewhat? Because are you saying that to perform a Shakespeare play, there are specific costume styles that relate to his performance because of Shakespeare's place in history?
The short answer is no. There has never actually been a single specific style integral to the plays or demanded for in their productions. As you know, theatrical conventions for costuming of Shakespeare plays have continued to change over the years and the centuries, as, have the set designs and the acting styles, just about everything. But we do have a good idea of what the costume style used by Shakespeare's acting company when they were at the Globe. His actors would have worn contemporary Elizabethan Jacobean clothing, no matter when or where the action in the play takes place. In other words, the actors wore the fashions that we see in portraits from that period, as well as everyday clothes that they would have been seeing circa 1600. It was a period when social conventions of dress were very, very important. So the actors would have been costumed in garments and accessories appropriate to the character's social rank.
And not necessarily the actor. So it was okay for actors to be above their rank.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it caused concern and discussion, but no, this was accepted. You're on stage. You are now portraying this character. But you want to capture the social rank, the economic status, the profession, the age, gender, and even location of where they might live, such as city or country. And at the time, there were very strict social guidelines as to what people could and should wear. Clothes identified a person's place in the community. On stage, as at court, a king's costume then would include crown, jewels, furs, expensive fabrics. But the difference was that on stage, the crown was made of metal, the jewels were colored glass, and the fur was probably rabbit dyed to look like ermine. What's fascinating is that the textiles would be the real thing. The velvets, the satins. And at the other end of the scale, of course, workmen, like the mechanicals in Midsummer Night's Dream, would have been dressed in rough homespun cloth. So there was no commitment to accuracy in costumes in terms of historical accuracy. And the best known example is when Cleopatra is fainting and she calls out to have her laces cut. And this is exactly what would have been needed for a woman who was dressed up, laced up actually, in a Jacobean bodice, but had no connection with ancient Egypt.
This is quite a lot of detail in terms of fabric and the glass jewels and different things. How do we know this much about the costumes for William Shakespeare's stage?
Aha. It's amazing that we actually know as much as we do, because there are almost no historical documents on how the plays were originally staged or costumed. But we have a couple of things. We've got Johannes de Witt's sketch, A View of Swan Theatre, London. This is circa 1596, showing an audience in the stage with a play in progress and the actors in contemporary clothing. But we don't know what play. More important for costume history, there's Henry Peacham's 1595 sketch of actors costumed for what is believed to be Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. Now, this picture is really important because although the play is set in ancient Rome, 6 of the 7 actors in the picture are wearing Elizabethan costume, but with added accessories that do suggest ancient Rome. The General Titus has a swag of cloth wrapped around his chest in a sort of vaguely Roman manner, and he wears a crown of laurel leaves. His sons wear pieces of armor. Tamara, the captured Goth queen, is in Elizabethan dress, and her 2 sons wear doublets and hose. It's the 7th actor whose costume is extraordinary. The actor playing Aaron the Moor is shown as black-skinned, bare-legged, wearing a very short, almost Romanish type of tunic. And really, what strikes me most about this picture is the sense of costume. You can identify the characters by their dress. They're not trying to be historically accurate, but they are establishing a theatrical illusion of otherness in time and space. Now, in addition to this, there are other major source of information are the diaries of Philip Henslowe. He was the owner and manager of the Rose Theatre, which was the Globe's major rival, and also an inventory by an actor, Edward Allen, of costumes owned by his acting company, the Admiral's Men, and they also were connected with Henslowe's theatre. Allen's inventory from around 1597 includes 14 cloaks, 17 gowns, 14 antique, as in old-style suits, 11 jerkins and doublets, and 8 garments identified as Venetian. What stands out is the sheer lushness of the clothes, both in fabric and in their very rich decorations. Here are just a couple of examples. A scarlet cloak with broad gold laces and gold buttons of the same down the side. There's another scarlet cloak, this one laid with the down of silver lace and silver buttons. There's a black velvet gown with white fur, a velvet doublet with gold lace and speckles. Now, these are for both men and women. And there's satin, there's silks, there's velvets, there's cloth of gold, cloth of silver. The colors are kaleidoscopic. Obviously, there's much black. But also there's red, yellow, purple, ginger, carnation, a kind of red, and even a dress in angel silk. So the diaries in Allen's inventory are business records, but they document the grandeur of the costumes, their quality, and their value.
Where did Shakespeare's company get these costumes? Or I guess, where did Philip Henslowe get the costumes? Were they borrowing them or buying them? Where would they have procured all of this in the first place?
They bought secondhand clothes. The costumes are by far the greatest expense in the Globe's budget, and same with Henslowe. And you'll remember that Shakespeare lived in an age of absolute conspicuous consumption. in a period that loved luxurious clothing, and this had to be reflected accurately in the costumes on stage. Now, luckily, there was a major trade in secondhand clothing, and that's where the theaters acquired their costumes. So they bought clothes, adapted them, trimmed them up, and that's how they were able to dress the actors in silks, satins, velvets of the quality worn in court. During this time, clothing, it circulated as almost a form of currency. Clothes were made, bought, sold, resold, handed on, pawned, bartered, traded, left in wills, given as gifts, used to pay off debts. In personal papers, clothes are all over the place. So we really know rather a good deal about them. And people often acquired clothes that they could not use because the garments were inappropriate to their own social status. For example, a duchess gave her gorgeous old red silk velvet cloak to her maid as a New Year's gift. The cape could not be worn by the woman who received it, but it could be sold, and the playhouse was a good place to sell it.
Arguably the king of double meanings, Shakespeare embeds multiple interpretations of a character's personality or motives into the language and even the music of his plays. Would the costumes that Shakespeare had his characters wear on stage serve a similar dramatic purpose during a performance?
Okay, brilliant question. And the answer is absolutely. Because there's every reason to believe that this would be true. Directors, designers do this today. And if you dig into Shakespeare, you can find it there. It's there in the text. He was so aware of what costumes could signify. And a very simple, basic example is when characters are in disguise. This is something that happens a lot in Shakespeare plays. They'll change in appearance, and this creates a doubled individual. So it was both the original and the impersonation. And the characters talk about this. And of course, some of the best known disguises in the characters are when a young woman puts on a man's doublet and hose and is accepted by strangers as a young man, and generally finds this very empowering. This is your Rosalind and As You Like It, Viola and Twelfth Night. But there are other plays as well. There's Imogen in Cymbeline, there's Juliet in Two Gentlemen of Verona, and in Merchant of Venice, when Shylock's daughter elopes, she also is disguised as a male servant.
For modern playwrights or people that are performing Shakespeare on stage today, they have stage directors and costume designers that pick out what's going to go along with each particular character. But as we look back in history and take Shakespeare's plays and bring them forward, where do we get information on how Shakespeare would have dressed his characters himself?
Okay, so obviously he's not writing any stage directions telling us what people do or where.
Unfortunately, that would be nice. I often wish that he would have just like a side note or something, Shakespeare, please.
Never mind. He was there. If they had a question, they could just turn to him and say, Will, what am I doing in this part? As simple as that. But anyway, he does give lots of clues through the dialogue. This is why actors spend so much time in rehearsal, I think, among other reasons. So there are the clues in the dialogue, and he's also able to call upon signals that are sent through certain iconographic images, sometimes as simple as whether a woman's hair is up or down, if a man has his hat on or off.
Which happens in Hamlet. I've read that's a big deal for Hamlet to have his hat off.
It is, because disordered or even discarded clothing, really could represent madness. So this is exactly Hamlet being described as entering Ophelia's room with his clothes in mess, his stockings falling down, and without a hat. And in King Lear, in thinking about discarded clothing, Edgar disguises himself as a madman by removing his clothes and going about nearly naked. Shakespeare uses clothes as subtle psychological indicators, and over again. And also in those indicators, you'll sometimes find prompts for the actual costumes. So for instance, in Twelfth Night, we know that Olivia is dressed in deep mourning, both for her father and her brother. But because she's asked to lift her veil to draw the curtains and show her face, And in that play, we also learn a lot about Malvolio's delusions as a social climber, because he imagines himself in a branch velvet gown, but he also appears in very inappropriate cross-gartered yellow stockings.
In her book, Shakespeare and Costume, Patricia outlines several of Shakespeare's characters in terms of what they wore. But Patricia, I hoped you would walk us through one particular character, and that's Othello. Specifically, would Othello have had painted his skin as part of the costume for that character in the 17th century?
I think he would have. He would have had to. And perhaps the Peacham drawing is an indication of that as well. Because he would not have been played by a black actor. There simply were none in Shakespeare's acting company, and all roles were played by members of the company. So one of the white actors would have had to black up for the roles. And it's, of course, it's what actors did until quite recently. There were only two notable exceptions. One was Ira Aldridge, the African-American actor who toured Europe playing Othello in the 1820s to rave reviews. And Paul Robeson, also American, who played Othello in London in 1930 and New York in 1944. One of the earliest of examples of a black actor having played Othello is Willard White, who was in Trevor Nunn's production of Othello in 1989. And, when we imagine the Globe's Othello, and we think about what would he have worn, well, again, Peacham's drawing suggests a possibility that maybe in the early scenes, contemporary doublet and hose, probably with armor, since he'd been hired, as a general for the Venetian senators, by the Venetian senators. But he might have switched to Moorish or Arab robes at some point after they arrive in Cyprus, especially certainly robes for the final scene in the bedroom. In Shakespeare's London audience, they would have recognized the exotic robes, not only from drawings and paintings, but because the Moorish ambassador to the court of Queen Elizabeth had been in the city for 6 months, accompanied by his entourage, and this was in 1600. And we actually still have a painting of him. And he's enormously impressive in full Arab dress. And, really what I've just described, there was the type of costuming used in many recent productions, with that variation of Western dress towards the more exotic once they're in Cyprus. And it is always effective. And again, it's one of those subtle indicators of something changing in a character and being signaled through the clothing, through the costume.
Well, speaking of changing and using costume to do that, one of the popular conventions that Shakespeare used was that of a woman pretending to be a man, and even a woman pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman sometimes. And I wonder if this was a popular theater convention because the companies were all male. Did it make costuming easier if the man didn't have to be disguised?
As you just said, there are no women on the London stage, not before 1660. And so it was very logical that boys would play the women's roles. And of course, remember that these are not children. These are really people in their teens. And as for the actual costumes and the dress, Elizabethan and Jacobean dress for women actually made the gender transformation very easy. Women were laced into bodices designed to flatten the bosom, so to create a flat front. Skirts were wide and well supported out from the body. Even the deep folds of lace that you could put at a cuff could cover most of the hand. And as long as the voice was not too baritone and there was no sign of a beard, the illusion was successful. And, I think the interesting demands on the actor who plays Rosalind or Viola was, you've got this boy who's playing a girl, but who now is pretending to be a boy.
Patricia, this is just a fascinating topic, I think, to discover the details from fur to glass jewels and velvet that got used on Shakespeare's stage. I know we would love to explore this further. As someone who's written a lot on this topic, what are some of your favorite books or resources that we should look at to learn more?
Okay, to begin with, actually my own book that I co-edited with Bella Mirabella, Shakespeare and Costume, because it is a collection of essays by some of the most notable scholars within the field, working both with early modern dress and with theatre history. And not only their articles, but their own research sources really do give somebody a very good list of things to look at. Otherwise, there are two favorite books, which is General Book on Shakespeare by Stanley Wells, who has written many, many books, but I like his Shakespeare for All Time as a good introduction. And then, of course, you also want to have a look at various costume books that deal with the actual clothing of the period. And one of the most beautiful and useful in terms of detail is In Fine Style, The Art of Tudor and Stuart Fashion, and it's by Anna Reynolds. So those are two. And along, because there are lots of good websites too that you can find.
Excellent resources for sure. We'll make sure to link to those in today's show notes. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what is the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? And my friends in England tell me I am supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Ovid's Metamorphoses, a book that Shakespeare turned to a lot.
Absolutely. What an excellent choice. And a great time to read it when you're stranded on a deserted island, for sure.
Indeed.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Oh, I'm looking at violence in screen adaptations of Shakespeare, including comedies, including Taming of the Shrew. So I'm having a lot of fun with that.
Excellent. Is that going to be a book, or are you putting that online?
No, it's an article for a book that's going to be coming out on Shakespeare on screen.
Excellent. Make sure you let us know when that's available. We'll be excited to keep up with you and read your next Shakespeare installment. Patricia Lennox, thank you so much for being here today and talking Shakespeare and costume with us. It's been a joy to have you.
It's been a joy to be here.
Links to the costume guides and examples of the pictures of Elizabethan actors dressed in some of the famous characters from Shakespeare's plays that Patricia talked about in today's episode are all available for you in the show notes for today's episode, which you can find at CassidyCash.com/episode 32. That's CassidyCash.com/EP32. In September 2019, I'm taking a group over with British History Tours to walk through the life of William Shakespeare. We'll be spending a couple of days in Stratford-upon-Avon, and then we'll travel over to London to see the Globe, where we'll have a private behind-the-scenes tour there, and we're hoping to get to see a play. And I want you to go with us. It would be amazing to get to meet you at all, but certainly to get to meet you in William Shakespeare's hometown would be amazing. Please consider traveling with us and get your early bird tickets while they last. There's still a few of them left, but we are only giving early bird tickets to the first 8 people who sign up. But you can still grab some of those and get all of the details about the trip at CassidyCash.com/travel Shakespeare. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. Until next time, I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.